Genoese sails broke the dawn haze off Marmara on 29th of May 1453, and the men on the Theodosian Walls understood in a single breath that the city would not fall that night. The relief squadron had been expected 3 days later, if it came at all. Instead, it slipped the Ottoman blockade in the grey light before sunrise, ran for the Blachane shore, and put fresh soldiers and barrels of powder onto the quay at the precise hour Mehmed's janissaries forced the little postern, called the Kerkoporta, and raised their banner above the inner wall. For 50 days, the defenders had held roughly 7,000 to 8,000 men against an army many times their number. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. The breach at the Kerkoporta had been the nightmare every commander feared. A gate left ajar near the Blachane quarter, a trickle of soldiers becoming a flood, the cry of the city taken. But the Genoese landing struck the same sector within minutes, and the newcomers, unbloodied and unpanicked, threw themselves into the gap. Giovanni Giustiniani Longo had fallen gravely wounded that morning, and word of his withdrawal had already begun to spread its poison through the ranks. Yet the sight of relief coming ashore did what no speech could. The defenders sealed the postern, drove the intruders back down the slope, and hurled the assault into the ditch below the walls. But what turned in that hour would take decades to fully reveal. By mid-morning, the great assault had spent itself against the Theodosian stones, and Mehmed II, 21 years old, and staking his throne on this one prize, watched his best troops die in the fosse. The bombards cast by Orban had battered the walls for weeks, and the fleet hauled overland into the Golden Horn had turned the defenders' flank. None of it mattered now. The janissaries, the Sultan's own household soldiers, had gone in believing the city was theirs and come back broken. A second general assault, with the campaigning season closing and supply lines strained thin across Thrace, was more than the army would bear. Halil Pasha, the Grand Vizier who had counseled caution from the first, found his voice again in the war council. The younger men who had pressed for the storm, Zaganos Pasha among them, had nothing to answer. Within days, the siege lines came up. The bombards were dragged back from the ruined ground before the walls, the camp struck, and the long columns turned north and west toward Edirne. Constantinople, against every expectation of the age, still stood. The consequences of that retreat would reach far beyond the walls of one city. But first we must follow the Sultan home. A young sultan who had promised his court the second Rome now rode back to Edirne with empty hands. Mehmed's authority had never rested on quiet inheritance. He had taken the throne amid doubt, and he had answered that doubt by pointing at Constantinople and vowing to make it his. The failure at the walls did not merely cost him soldiers. It reopened a rift inside the Ottoman state that the capture of the city would have sealed forever. Halil Pasha's circle, the older statesman who had always favored negotiation over reckless glory, could now argue that the whole enterprise had been folly. The war party that had cheered the assault fell silent or fell from favor. Mehmed held power, but he held it warily, a ruler whose great gamble had come apart in full view of his army. Around him, the provincial lords and the janissary corps took the measure of a sultan diminished. The Ottoman machine did not stop, but it no longer moved with the certainty of the inevitable, and men who watch a strong hand falter begin, quietly, to imagine other hands. Constantine Ilenth Palaiologos, last of his line, awoke on the 30th of May as the emperor who had held the Queen of Cities. He had expected to die on the walls. Instead, he was credited across Christendom with the deliverance, and he spent the years that followed doing the unglamorous work that survival demands. The Theodosian Walls, cracked and gapped by Orban's guns, had to be rebuilt stone by stone. The treasury, emptied by the siege, had to be refilled. The harbor defenses and the chain across the Golden Horn had to be made ready for a sultan who might return. None of it came free. The Genoese had not sailed to Constantinople out of charity, and the Latin powers that helped save the city expected to be repaid in coin and in loyalty. The old wound of the Church Union, proclaimed at Florence in 1439 and hated by most of the Byzantine faithful, festered anew. The slogan still muttered in the streets, "Better the Sultan's turban than the Cardinal's hat," now carried an edge of irony, for it was Latin ships and Latin powder that had kept the turban out. Cardinal Isidore of Kiev pressed the Union's cause. Lucas Notaras, and the men of the city weighed every concession against the debts now owed. The city lived, but it lived indebted. The blow to Mehmed's standing did what no foreign army could. It turned the House of Osman against itself. A sultan whose legitimacy had been mortgaged to the taking of the city, and who had failed to take it, became a sultan whose brothers, cousins, and rivals could be imagined in his place. The janissaries, proud and dangerous, remembered who had ordered them into the ditch. The provincial governors, the beys who supplied men and grain, calculated where their interests lay. Rival princes gathered backers. Some looked to the war faction, some to Halil Pasha's cautious men, some to the frontier lords who had always chafed at central control. The Ottoman state, which in another timeline would have consolidated around the glory of conquest, instead pulled in competing directions. This was not collapse. The empire remained vast and formidable. But the succession, contested where it might have been clean, cost the Ottomans years of inward struggle, years in which their neighbors could breathe. The scholars did not sail. In the history that did not happen here, the fall of Constantinople scattered Greek learning westward, and refugees carried their manuscripts and their Greek into the studies of Florence and Venice, feeding a renaissance already underway. In this timeline, the manuscripts stayed on their shelves, the workshops kept their apprentices, and the men who copied Plato and Aristotle did so in a living Constantinople rather than in exile. That changed the texture of the age. Greek learning still reached Italy, but as trade rather than as rescue, exchanged between partners across the sea instead of salvaged from a grave. Florentine and Venetian agents came to the city to buy books and hire tutors and commission copies, and they dealt with a Byzantium that was a going concern. The classical inheritance flowed west more slowly, more deliberately, and with a Greek capital still standing behind it as a source rather than a memory. What that meant for the shape of the Renaissance, no one in 1453 could have guessed. Venice and Genoa recalculated first, because their fortunes rose and fell on the Aegean and the Black Sea. For a generation they had traded and schemed under the shadow of an Ottoman advance that looked unstoppable. Now, the shadow had a crack in it. A sultan checked at the walls of Constantinople was a sultan who could be bargained with, resisted, played against his rivals. Hungary, long the bulwark on the Danube, took heart. The Byzantine remnant, still holding the city, part of the Peloponnese under the despotate of the Morea, and a scatter of Aegean islands, found itself courted rather than written off. No single power dominated the eastern Mediterranean now. Instead, the sea became contested ground, a balance held by wary hands. The Genoese guarded their colony at Galata across the Golden Horn and their stations on the Black Sea. The Venetians pressed their own claims. The Ottomans, absorbed in their own quarrels, could not sweep the board. It was not peace. It was something more durable and more anxious than peace, a standoff of many powers where there might have been one dominion. And then came the slow reckoning of what all of it had cost. A generation on, the survival of Constantinople looked less like a triumph than like a burden carried a long way. Byzantium endured, but as a smaller Christian capital hemmed by debt and dependent on Latin goodwill, neither restored to the greatness of its centuries nor erased from the map. The emperor after Constantine ruled a city that had learned to bargain for its life. Its churches still divided over the union, its treasury never quite full, its walls never quite safe. The Ottomans endured too, formidable still, but delayed, turned inward, denied the capital that would have crowned their rise. The powers of the sea kept their contested balance, and the scholars kept their manuscripts, and the great migration of Greek learning that in another world lit the studies of Italy came instead as a trade among the living. It is tempting to call this a happier ending, but that is not what the record of these decades suggests. A city spared is not a city healed. What the survival of Constantinople cost in debts and divisions and wars deferred rather than avoided, and what it spared the powers around it is the harder and truer question, and it is the one this timeline leaves us holding.